It's noon Eastern time. So hi everyone, and a big welcome from ADS Dental Transitions. Thank you for joining Matt and Adam to learn the do's and don'ts of selling a dental practice. Before we get started, feel free to type in chat what location you are from and if you're a dentist. And if you're not a dentist, what professional role you play that made you want to attend this webinar. There will be a question and answer portion, the last 15 minutes of the webinar. So you can either type your questions in chat throughout the presentation. I will read them at the end, or you can just wait and verbally ask once the presenters are completed. So next up, our stars, Matt and Adam. So Matt Scherer, you're on.
Thank you, Melanie. And welcome everyone. Good afternoon to some and good morning to others, depending on where you sit. I currently reside in Ohio, and my colleague Adam, who's on with us, is in Indiana. So about 32 years of dental experience. So hopefully you will get something, a nugget out of this next hour that you could take with you. We're going to talk about strategic preparation, optimizing efficiency, revitalizing your space, navigating pitfalls and financial empowerment, and maximizing your value. So it's kind of the do's and don'ts of the transition world, if you will. Starting out, strategic preparation. And I think the key to strategic preparation is really how far out in advance you start planning. Keep in mind, some of you on this webinar may already be doing a transition or in the middle of a transition or just starting your transition. But optimally, if you can start planning 3 to 5 years prior to wanting to retire, that's optimal. And the reason why it's optimal mostly is because the bank, when a buyer goes to the bank for financing for your dental practice, the bank will require at least 3 years of financials. And we feel that it gives you enough time to talk to your advisors and kind of figure out where you need to be or where you're at financially in order to retire. And if the sale of your dental practice is going to be a cherry on top or part of your retirement. And certainly if it's part of your retirement, you want to make sure that the dental practice is going to sell for the amount that you need in order to retire. Adam, anything else you want to add?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So to that point about planning a 3 to 5 years in advance, that's also a perfect time to have a professional appraisal performed. This will allow you to get kind of what estimated value of your practice would be. And we also look at pretty much every single line item from your tax return, every expense category, and we can isolate expenses that may be out of line, maybe high, maybe there's other things that we could optimize in order to maximize the value of the practice. So by having an appraisal performed, in which we kind of look at it like a bank would, where we would look at the last 3 years, we can really provide some light consulting as to how you can optimize your practice, how you can increase your profitability, and how your practices are performing compared to other practices in the region, maybe in the area, maybe nationally, for each of those expense categories.
Yeah, and as a business owner, we all know that there's discretionary expenses that we like to run through our business. So that 3 to 5 year time frame gives you an opportunity, gives us an opportunity, like Adam said, to look at your expenses and kind of point out, hey, why is this high, or why is this, where it's at? And then certainly if those are discretionary expenses, talking to your CPA and trying to, what we call, clean up the tax return, if you will. Because let's face it, when a buyer goes to a bank for financing, it's all about the cash flow of the practice, and can that cash flow of the practice support the buyer's needs, not only cover the expenses of the practice, but obviously the expense of the note for purchasing and their personal expenses. Dental students are coming out of school these days with, upwards of $350,000 in student loan debt. So it's important. And honestly, the easier it is to see what we call the cash of the practice, or what the doctor's bringing home, the easier it's going to be to get the buyer financed. And certainly, those are things that buyers kind of, part of their checklist mentality is, wow, it's not very profitable, so I'm going to go ahead and ding the purchase price. Even though when you get into professional appraisal, all that information is taken into account. So you just want to give, I guess, for the better sake of words, less check marks to a buyer to want to decrease the value of the practice. Anything else there on Adam and strategic preparation?
Yeah, I think just, looking future forward thinking as far as how you want to transition, what your ideal scenario would be.
Yeah.
Do you want to, I think just the more prepared you can be in the years in advance, the better and smoother the transaction will go.
And I think if you think back to those of you on this call or webinar, when you bought or started your practice, how much planning did you take to find the right practice or find the right location, and how many people you engaged to help you in that process? And typically what we see is it's quite the opposite when a doctor goes to retire. We joke about it and we say, yeah, the doctor wakes up one day and says, oh, I'm going to retire, and then contacts, a transition specialist, and off they go. So I think it's like Adam said, anytime you can plan in advance, and the more time you can plan in advance, the better off you're going to be.
Which brings us kind of to our next point, optimizing efficiency. What are some strategies, Matt, you would implement to maintain your production levels, but without, compromising the quality of care, things like that, as you kind of think about transitioning?
Yeah, it seems like another phenomenon in dentistry, and I'm sure it's probably like this in other businesses, but as we think about retiring, we think, okay, I'm going to go ahead and slow the practice down, take my foot off the gas, take more time off, things of that nature. And really by doing that, what you're doing is, you're devaluing the practice. Think about how long it took you to build your practice to the level it is today, 20, 30, 40 years. And I can tell you it takes a year or less to, decrease that value. So it takes 20 to 40 years to increase the value, and then a very short time to decrease the value. So, again, it's planning in advance. And if you are thinking about, and we get it, when I go to retire, yeah, I want to work less for sure. Right, Adam? I mean, that's
100%.
That's what everybody wants to do.
On the beach, preferably.
But there's some things you could do to maybe work less, but maintain the value of your practice, or maintain the revenues of your practice, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, some of those things might be like, I don't know how many of you out there have looked at your fee schedule recently, or how many of you have raised your fees recently. I know I've talked to a lot of dentists, and, the fear is if I raise my fees, I'm going to lose patients. And then obviously my revenues go down and yada, yada, yada. But I think one thing you have to remember is everything has gone up in price over the last 5, 10, 15 years, right? And people know this and expect it. So I think by taking a look at your fee schedules and looking at when the last time you raised your fee schedules, I think it's a phenomenal thing to do, especially before you sell. You want to be the bad person and raise the fees, not have the buyer come in, raise the fees, and then look like, they're just doing it because they have to pay for this practice now that they bought, right?
Absolutely. And, to your point, they don't want to be the bad guy. They want, and a lot of dentists that we talk to probably have below market fees. And there's actually a consumer advocacy group called fairhealthconsumer.org, where you can purchase a fee schedule for your zip code. And I think a lot of dentists would be really surprised as to where the averages are now compared to where their fees are. And some even I've even coached some to to boast about, hey, our fees are in line with fairconsumerhealth.org, which is a consumer advocacy group. Um, and as long as they have that kind of disclaimer there, I think the patients are at ease knowing that, okay, well, if this consumer advocacy group says the fees for a pro fee should be X and my dentist fees are X, then I feel good about, even though the fees might be a little higher than I'm used to, they're still in line with averages. And if they were to call around, they would probably experience some fees that are much higher than that, those consumer advocacy fees. So it's a great resource for dentists that are considering raising their fees more to market. Another thing you could do, obviously, is have an audit on your PPO fee schedules. A lot of times dentists don't know that they can renegotiate their PPO fee schedules. Now, some insurances might be a little more stringent than others, but there are third-party companies that will look at your current PPO fee schedules and see if there's room to negotiate higher fees, which, that's an increase of income and collections instantly. You don't have to do hardly any work for that. So that would be definitely an optimization strategy I would coach all my clients to do, is look at the PPO fee schedules and see where they fall, and see if a third party could get those increased, because it really doesn't take any work on your part to get paid more for the services you render.
Yeah, and I don't know that dentists necessarily share their fees with other dentists, but certainly I would venture to say that, if you feel like if you haven't raised your fees in years, your competition or other dentists in the area probably have. So don't let that scare you off. Again, I think, just being a consumer and going obviously to the dentist, I expect that, things are going to go up in the future. So.
And also maybe cutting some of those low and reimbursing plans would be a good thing to do. You might, there might be some attrition, or there might be some patients that, now that you're no longer considered quote unquote in network, they might look elsewhere. But as long as your front office staff is really well trained to explain the benefits out of network, and if your fees are, within their usual and customary fees, they might not see hardly any difference in their out-of-pocket liability. So really looking at those plans closely, seeing which you could let go of, seeing maybe there's a plan or two that, you may have, a handful of patients on. Well, that might be something you should cut.
Yeah, that's a great point. Also looking at when's the last time you did any type of marketing? Typically, again, we see, the retiring dentist hasn't done marketing in years. Some don't even have a website. So, definitely instituting maybe some marketing back into the practice, because let's face it, when a young doctor comes in and buys a practice, or even a doctor in general buys a practice, they're typically going to market that practice for themselves, right? So they're going to institute some marketing. So that could be, if that's an expense item that you don't have on your P&L marketing, the bank may look at it and say, okay, well, we know the buyer coming in is going to probably want to do some marketing. So that's an expense item we have to account for. And now we're deducting from the cash flow of the practice. So it's not going to hurt you to institute marketing. Adam, you've got experience in building websites and things like that. So, at least get a website for yourself. We know those things are very inexpensive to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's an awesome asset to have. If you can prove that your website generates new patients on a monthly basis, that's going to be a very attractive benefit for a potential buyer. One thing I would advise, there are a lot of, third-party, dental website providers that own the website, own the code, own the content, and you're basically leasing it. So I would advise you to have a professional website developer build your own website. So it's an asset that you actually own in full. And also, have you maybe pay one of your staff members or whomever to draft content. So again, it's your asset and you're not leasing it essentially from a marketing company. I've done quite a few projects from people that are looking, either the vendor is looking to let go of website management, or they just don't want to have that high monthly expense of paying the website vendor. And so, owning your own website is going to be an awesome asset for a potential buyer. So I would definitely recommend that, certainly.
Yep. And I think when you think about the points that we talked about, again, it goes back to that planning 3 to 5 years. And if you've talked to your CPA or financial advisor and they say, you know what, you need to, you need X out of your practice in order to retire or go work another, 10 years or 5 years or 3 years or whatever it might be. Again, if the practice starts to decline, buyers see that and won't buy the practice because it's been declining, and it's tough to say why the decline is happening. And B, again, it's if they do buy the practice, it's just another check mark to say, hey, you know what? I don't think it's worth this much. And again, a professional appraisal will take into account those points, but in a buyer's mind, that's what they're typically thinking. So,
just as a side note to that, I feel my impression of some of the younger first-time buyer dentists is they want a very aesthetically pleasing, and this kind of jumps into our next topic, which is revitalizing your space and practical tips to enhancing your office environment. But your web asset and your online assets are also part of your kind of overall aesthetics of your practice. And I feel like, a lot of the younger dentists, they want something that's really, clean and modern, and that, website and office. And Matt, I think some of the most important parts in revitalizing your space would be, removing some of the clutter. I know, a lot of dentists will collect nostalgic items over the years and things like that. And they have little trinkets from their travels, and, maybe putting some of those, away in a closet somewhere where you can keep them, but not on display. Buyers prefer, especially I think young buyers prefer kind of a cleaner, more modern, contemporary look and feel. Again, relative to the website as well. And there's a lot of things you can do that's a nominal expense to kind of make, the eye appeal, the curb appeal more attractive for potential buyers. Matt, would you like to?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done some talks to some study groups, and the one question I've asked in the past is first of all, how many dentists have a back entrance to their office? And those dentists who have a back entrance to their office, how many times do they walk through the front door in the morning when they open up before any patients get there? And it's interesting to see the hands that go up, especially on the number of dentists who really don't, quote, walk through the front door of their office. And the reason why I asked that question is, when you walk in the front door through the waiting room of your practice, you get to see what the patient sees when they walk into your practice. And just like selling a home, curb appeal sells, right? So you want to just make sure, Adam touched on some things, clean up if there's clutter in the waiting area or reception area, as a lot of people like to call it. Clean it up, tidy it up. If there's ripped furniture or carpet that's extremely stained, things like carpet and paint and, wall coverings, it's a very inexpensive way to increase your curb appeal in the practice. And we believe, especially again, going back to the 3 to 5 year planning, the return on investment will be there for you.
Yeah, especially for those offices that had maybe paint 10 years ago where the color palettes were a little bit different than what, dental offices look like today. A nice neutral colored paint, neutral colored carpeting, even painting some of the cabinets or, filing cabinets, things like that. Just kind of add to the overall aesthetics and the cleanliness of the practice.
In a lot of practices, and again, this is a lot of this stuff that we're talking about are things that buyers have said to us in the past about practices. And we always try to give feedback to the seller as to why the buyer didn't buy the practice or whatnot. But one of the big things that I've seen is carpet in the operatories. I can tell you buyers will come in and say, why do they have carpet in the operatories? Why aren't there hard surfaces? And certainly it's not a huge expense, and it doesn't have to be, Taj Mahal flooring, but, simple LVP, rip out the carpet, put in some hard surface flooring. That'll go a long way in the curb appeal, if you will.
To that point too, a lot of dentists obviously throughout their careers will collect various equipment, dental equipment that they store in their practice. And so it may not even be functional anymore. So it does make sense to just get that out of the way. There's no sense in holding on to it if it's non-functioning, and it definitely doesn't add anything to the aesthetics of the practice. So, removing some of those non-functional pieces of equipment that's just taking up space, it could make the office look bigger. Again, looking through the buyer's eyes. If you are currently chartless, but still have your filing cabinets with all those yellow charts stacked on the wall, it may be nice to get those out of there, put them in a closet, maybe even tear down those kind of cabinet style wall fixtures, and paint the wall, repair the wall, something like that. So again, the first impression of a buying dentist, especially those who are trained usually chartless, and they see a wall full of charts, it may be a slight turnoff. Even though you are chartless, it just the look of it being there may or may not deter a buyer, or at least put a weird taste in their mouth, so to speak. So
yeah, absolutely. And kind of going back a little bit, in talking about wanting to slow down as you get ready to retire, and maybe work less days, if you will. I think one of the things that it might be a good idea is to take a look at trying to consolidate your schedule. If does it make sense to go to 3 days a week or 4 days a week if you're 5 days a week, and give yourself a break? Because a lot of times what I hear from retiring dentists is, I'm just tired, I'm worn out, I just want days off. If you can maybe open up a little bit longer in a day, yes, you're working a longer day, but you're there, and then you're having a day off to refresh your body, your hands, whatever, your mind, and then get back after it. Look at some of those things to help kind of slow down, if you will, but without slowing down the production or the collections. You were going to add to that, Adam?
Well, I was just going to mention those one-time expenses, whether it's carpeting, flooring, etc. That's a one-time expense that a buyer is not going to incur on a regular basis. It's not an operating expense. So, that would be kind of considered extra cash flow for the purchaser, or for the buyer.
For the buyer, yeah, for the purchaser.
Yeah. So keeping those receipts, making sure those are, calculated in the appraisal, also could increase cash flow, therefore increasing the value.
Yeah, Adam brings up a good point. So one of the things that we do in an appraisal is we're looking for those one-time expenses. So, hey, I updated my systems last year, put all new computers. It was a hit to you, but it's not going to be necessarily a hit to a buyer, because the buyer's not going to have to do that again for several years. So spending a little bit of money, keeping, as Adam said, keep those receipts, and letting your transition specialist know, or consultant know, that what were our one-time expenses will help. And then certainly the reason why we say keep your receipts, because when the buyer goes to the bank, the bank's not going to assume that those one-time expenses. Obviously, as transition consultants, we're interacting a lot of times with the bank, so we can explain that. But a lot of times the bank might want to see, proof that these are one-time expenses. So it's definitely key to keep receipts on anything, whether it's a piece of equipment that you bought, things like that. And again, going back to maybe the equipment, stay away from large ticket items like a CBCT if you're getting ready to sell in the next couple of years, unless you absolutely, we call it wants and needs. Do you need it or do you want it? And we talk to buyers about that. Is this a want or a need? Because again, buyers look at, well, the practice doesn't have a CBCT. Well, does it need a CBCT, or do you just want a CBCT? So that's not a reason to deduct the value of the practice. If it's a want, that's on you. If it's a need, that's on the selling doctor. Doing things like, especially again, I'm gonna harp on this, 3 to 5 years in advance. Let's say you're not, digital with your X-ray, buying a laptop and maybe 2 sensors and taking it from room to room to room is fairly inexpensive. I know sensors aren't cheap, but if you can become more efficient by using digital x-ray and you can buy it far enough in advance, again, it's that check mark mentality when buyers look at the practice. Is the practice antiquated or is it up to date? And if it's antiquated, guess what? In my mind, I'm taking away the value.
Certainly. And I think that kind of falls in line with our next kind of topic, which is navigating the pitfalls. Those large equipment purchases, if they're not going to have an immediate ROI on your practice, it's probably, and buyers also have their preferences as to which large pieces of equipment they want to utilize in their practice. So it might be better to hold off and let the buyer purchase those, unless again, it's a need that is imminent.
Absolutely. And when we talk about pitfalls, I think the biggest pitfall that we see, or at least in my experience before selling practices, I was doing financing for the largest dental lender in the country. And it's what we call the FSBO, just like in home sales, it's for sale by owner. And some of the pitfalls that doctors fall into, I'll just have my CPA and attorney sell my practice for me. Well, that's fine, and there are some attorneys that are certainly capable, but some of the things you have to remember is number one, your CPA and your attorney, unless you're the only client that they have, their day job is not to sell your dental practice. Transition consultants' day job is to sell your dental practice, and I would say the biggest thing in selling a practice is, how do I if I'm doing it on my own, how do I maintain the confidentiality? Because let's be honest, most dentists do not want their staff or patients to know up front that they're selling their dental practice. There's always a time during the transition to tell patients and staff, but certainly, off the bat, it could have a negative or detriment to your office. So, it's also the marketing of your practice. So, again, if you're going to want to use your CPA or attorney, do they have the means to go ahead and market your practice? Not necessarily just, the beauty about being an ADS member is we cast a wide net when we market the practice. We cast it, throughout the country. So, those are some things to think about when you're asking yourself, wow, do I want to pay somebody to sell my practice or do I want to do it myself? Anything else that you can think of, Adam, that would be a pitfall?
Absolutely. I think a big one is kind of the emotional buffer between the buyer and the seller. They can both kind of put their stresses on us and not each other. So oftentimes when we're working a transaction and, the buyer and seller are engaged one-to-one, they may not always agree. And so we can kind of be that intermediary in between the two parties so that there's a lot of emotion wrapped up in these transactions. The seller's selling their baby that they've had for 30 years. A buyer's taking a loan for, $500,000 or $1 million. So there's a lot of stress on both sides. And so we act as that buffer so we can kind of keep things peaceful and keep the process moving forward without getting too many emotions wrapped up into the process.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things to really navigate in a transition. And certainly if your advisor has never transitioned to practice before, how do you navigate that stuff? Typically we represent the seller in a transition. The buyer has their own, but we help navigate bank requirements from you selling your practice. I had a one recently where the dentist, the bank emailed me and said, hey, there's a lien search. The lien search came back and there's a lien on the practice. It's an equipment lien. I called my seller and I said, hey, do you have a lien on your practice? Oh no, I paid that piece of equipment off. Well, guess what? The bank never released the lien. So I said, okay, well, you've got to, he's like, well, I don't know what to do. What do I do? I said, well, call the bank and tell them you need this, this, and this. Well, I don't know. I don't have time for that. Can you do it? So, I called the bank and did it for him and got the lien release letter for, so it's things like that. It's the bank requirements, all the closing information that needs to happen on both sides of the deal. And as Adam said, the emotional thing, I think, is the biggest. When I was at the bank, I think that's what probably killed more deals when they were non-transition consultant deals, was the emotions between the buyer and seller. I always tell this story and people laugh, but I had a deal that fell apart over a 55-inch TV. And I can tell you that you can buy a 55-inch TV these days probably for about $400. Why did it fall apart? Because the TV was supposed to stay, it was going, and now there's a trust factor that got broken. And buyer didn't trust the seller anymore over something little, and the deal fell apart. So,
yeah, and I think just to add a little icing on that, being part of the ADS, everyone aligned has a lot of experience in these transactions. We know, again, we can help the dentist avoid those pitfalls. We have, a lot of experience, and we will walk the transaction from start to finish the whole way through. So I think the dentists generally have a lot better experience. It's a smoother transition, and we work with both sides. So I think it's just advantageous for a dentist seller, to work with a consultant so that everything just goes a lot more smoothly and it has a higher probability of success.
Absolutely. And I think to that point, if you talk to one of your ADS transition consultants in your area, they know best what practices sell for. The tough part about selling a dental practice is they're all unique. There's no like dental practices. They're like in certain ways, like certain PPOs that you take, or your fee for service, or you have this equipment and that equipment. But boy, oh boy, they're all over the board with revenues and, this, that, and the other. And, they know best where to price, where the appraisal should come in and for the area and things like that. That's why it's important to have a specialist do the appraisal and help you through the transition.
And Matt, I know we're kind of winding down on our allotted time. Any kind of closing remarks for the maximizing value, financial empowerment?
Yeah, I would stress that, these are our opinions, obviously. Again, we've got combined over 23 years of experience on not only the sell side, but the buy side. Are we telling everyone out there to do all these things? Absolutely not. Again, I think, when I started out, if you can grab a nugget or two along the way, and it helps you with a smoother transition, or helps you to plan a little bit further in advance or whatnot, to because we all want the most for what we have, right? Especially when you put your blood, sweat, and tears in. The last thing you want to do, it kills us and pains us when we see or hear a dentist just shut their office down. So
Matt, Adam,
yeah.
we have a question from Henry Nichols. Henry, would you unmute yourself, please?
No? Did they write a question, or did they raise their hand?
Yeah, raise his hand. There he goes.
Hi, Henry.
Hello.
How are you?
So, trying to flesh out a guideline for calculating the price or the value of a general practice.
Ooh, good
question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. That's a great question.
Yeah. Can you give some kind of an idea of what percentage of gross collections or what percentage of net revenue you guys look at? I realize that these values are then adjusted up or down, but what's a rough idea?
Yeah, Henry, great question. I personally hate to use percentages because I can give you numerous examples where you have like practices and this one sells for 70% and this one sells for 50%, and why they do that. There are a lot of factors that go into an appraisal. But to answer your question, I think it was the ADA that put out that the average dental practice sells between 60 and 70% of collections. I think that the magic percentage is 65% of collections. I don't know if that answers your question directly, or you want more detailed information. But truthfully, to go through how we appraise a practice, there's so many things that we look at, like payer mix. Are you fee for service or PPO? What type of equipment, where you're located, what type of dentistry you actually do. If you're a general dentist, do you do high-end cosmetic dentistry? Do you do bread and butter dentistry? All those factors. How strong is your hygiene program? That factors into the value of a dental practice. So there's so many things that go into value, but generally speaking, they sell between that 60 and 70%. That helps.
Yeah, and we in our appraisals, we have a couple methodologies. We look at obviously the profitability and the capitalization of that profit, and also sales comparables. So we will look at ADS as a database of recently sold transactions that we look at and see how they line up against where we're pricing it. But a lot of it does come down to the profitability, because a practice may make $1 million but has $900,000 in expenses, and so there's not much left over. So obviously I don't think the percentage of collections is a great, it's a general guide, but it's not great, because the expenses are the other end of that fluctuate so dramatically.
Yeah, and I think to answer your question about net, obviously if you're 35% or higher, certainly that's we like to see that. Like Adam said, anything below that starts getting tough, because again, banks they lend on cash flow. Bottom line, does this practice support the needs of the buyer and the note? And if it doesn't, and they look for a ratio, and the ratio is typically a 1:2 ratio, meaning for every dollar in expense, they want $1.20 coming back in, and that's the cash flow, so that there's a buffer there for the buyer in case the practice does dip a little bit. Because let's face it, anytime somebody new comes in, or any change you make, there's a potential to lose patients. In our industry, okay. Go ahead. Somebody else have a...
Yeah, so we do have another question.
Okay. Hopefully that answered his question.
Yeah, did that answer your question?
Yes, it was a good starting point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we have one from Mohanad. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So the question is, what are your fees for listing the practice and complete the sales transaction? Do you represent the buyer or seller? And are your fees taken from buyer or seller?
Okay, that's a great question. So there are some, I don't know how every transition company operates. I know there are some transition companies out there that do represent the buyer and the seller, call it dual representation. And they typically charge the buyer anywhere from $5,000 to 3% of the transaction. And then the seller, they will charge 7%. We do not here at PMA. PMA represents the seller and the seller only. In our eyes, I don't feel that you can represent a buyer and a seller equally if they're not equally paying for your services. And the typical fee in the industry is anywhere from 7 to 10%. And again, that fee's generally collected once the practice sells.
Yeah, some brokers may have, some sort of engagement fee just to get the ball rolling, prepare the marketing materials, because obviously we do incur expenses in getting those prepared. But that commission, so to speak, to the consultants is paid by the seller as well upon closing. Yeah,
and typically, if a transition company collects a nominal fee up front to cover kind of the initial marketing, as Adam said, it's generally, once the practice is sold, it's deducted from the overall commissions. just like when we have a doctor that hires us to do an appraisal, we'll charge a fee for the appraisal. And then if a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, the doctor wants to use PMA to sell their practice, then that fee will be deducted off the commission. One of the things that we do, and then again, I can't speak for everybody, but you're asking the question is, if we do an appraisal, we'll charge $5,000 to do an appraisal, but we'll update it the next year for free for you. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, we have another one. If selling to our son, do we need to hire a transition specialist?
Great question.
How good of terms are you with your family?
Exactly. I will tell you in my experience with the bank, when I was at the bank, some of the toughest transitions were selling to a family member. Again, you don't necessarily need to hire a transitions consultant to, again, do the whole deal. I would definitely get a professional appraisal done. If you feel, to Adam's point, your relationship with your son or daughter or family member is great, that's super. I think the biggest thing is that I've seen is when there's a dental child and a non-dental child, and father or mother is giving dental child the practice at a discounted rate, or and the non-dental child, what are they getting from the parent? So that could cause some angst. So have a professional appraisal done. Again, we help navigate the whole process. So typically when we have a dentist that asks us to represent them with their, child that's buying, we reduce our fee quite a bit because we know we don't have to go out and market the practice. But if for some reason I've had it where we had a dentist, he was selling to his son and the son's like, you know what? I don't think I want to buy your practice. I want to move to, another state with my wife and start my own practice or buy my own practice. So certainly that happens as well. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I think having a consultant wouldn't hurt. Absolutely. And like Matt said, we would probably reduce our commission considerably, just so the simple fact we don't have to market it. We don't have to prepare all the marketing materials, all that stuff. We would just perform the appraisal and, kind of help the transaction see it through.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to navigate through that. And that's kind of where we would, I don't want to say do dual representation, but really help both, the son and daughter, the father and son or the father and daughter navigate all the ins and outs of it. I see there's another question. Hopefully that answers your question. I think there's another one, Mel, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Average, how long does it take from day one to complete the sell in an average market?
Yep.
So that's the $1 million question. How long does it take? And I can tell you, I would say probably 95% of my sellers have asked that question. How long is it going to take? And honestly, the answer is, I don't know. I can tell you though, that once a buyer has engaged with a letter of intent, it's called the LOI. Once a buyer has submitted an LOI and the seller has agreed on the purchase price, I would say it's probably about a 90-day time frame from there. By the time the buyer, a lot of times these buyers have to give their current employer 90 days notice. So it could take a little bit longer, but just to get through the financing and the due diligence and all that stuff, I would probably give it about a 90-day time frame from the time you get an LOI. But from the time you say, hey, I want to sell my practice to the time it sells, it's all over. There's just, if somebody can tell you the time frame, I think I'd probably go check with somebody else. Anything to add to that, Adam?
No, that's the $1 million question. We
Yeah.
wish we had the answer to, but some practices sell quicker than others, depending on so many factors. If the area is coveted, it's just, yeah, it's a timing thing, and there's no way to forecast that, unfortunately.
So I see another question. I think Jody asked that, do you handle all the contracts? So we do not handle the contracts. And I tell my sellers, the reason why we don't handle contracts, number one, we're not attorneys. And I don't want to practice law because if something went sideways in the deal, I'm on the hook for that. But what some companies do, they'll provide a draft purchase agreement contract. I'm not a fan of that, only because typically when the buyer or seller gives that to their attorney, guess what? The attorney's slicing and dicing it anyway. So what's the point? That's my personal opinion. Adam, I don't know if you have any other opinion on that.
Yeah. So, and I can only speak for PMA, of course, but we try to uncover all those nuances to a future purchase agreement well before the attorneys get their hands on it. Obviously, they charge hourly, so we have a special meeting that we take place between the buyer, seller, whoever, maybe a spouse, whatever, that we really uncover everything that goes into the purchase agreement, so that by the time the attorneys get their hands on it, we've got everything outlined nice and neatly. They know exactly how to draft it. So we try to do a lot of the front end legwork so that when it comes time to draft the agreements, they're all pretty straightforward and all the information is conveyed to the attorneys.
Yeah, great point. Looks like there's another question. Is there a better time to place practice on sale, for example, beginning of the year? I would say I think the slowest time in my experience has been summertime, at least from a buyer standpoint. It seems like things tend to slow down in the summertime because people are, kids are off school, people are going on vacation and things like that. So I don't know that I could pinpoint, is beginning of the year or end of the year. One thing you'll want to do when you're thinking about selling your practice is talking to your CPA about the tax implication. So a lot of times sellers try to sell at the end of the year because they know they're going to be retired after they sell and their income's going to drop quite a bit, so that the tax liability to them selling at the end of the year or the beginning of a next year is much less. But I would say, consult your CPA on that and see, what they feel is your tax liability, because that does play into account. Hopefully that answered your question. I think we got another one from, what is your appraisal fee now if I'm planning to sell in 5 years? And would be, yeah. So our fee personally, and I can't speak for all brokers out there, but we charge $5,000, and again, we will update it for no charge. And then certainly if you use us to sell your practice, then we go ahead and discount that on our commission.
One of the questions was, how can we contact you at PMA?
Oh,
so
okay.
Here's Matt. And
Adam would be Adam.
Yeah, I'm gonna get Adam's.
Yeah.
So feel free to email them. So Adam is Adam.
Yeah, and just so everyone on the line knows, I service all of Indiana and Cincinnati. So those are my territories. There are other affiliated consultants with the ADS that service other parts of the country, depending on where you're coming from.
Yeah, if you're looking to get an appraisal and you're in Texas, I would contact your local ADS transition consultant in Texas, which is Jeremy Brown.
And I will give you that as well.
Yeah. And Adam also covers Northern Kentucky. Forgot about that one, Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And then let me get you all the website.
Do we have any questions that somebody wants to unmute for? Great questions, by the way. We appreciate it. We're getting close to wrapping up. So if anybody has any last minute questions, we're happy to And certainly you can contact myself or Adam personally if you don't feel you want to ask the question in this setting. We're happy to. Who can we contact in California?
Yeah.
Yep, Melanie will be able to send you that information. Depends where you're at in California.
So, and you can also look on the website and it will direct you to the broker of that state and location, amongst other educational pieces, white papers, recorded webinars. So it's a great reference for everyone. All right. Well, it looks like we are at the end. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matt and Adam. Fantastic job. Very informative.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it. And again, we hope that, by attending this, you can take home, a couple things from what we talked about and optimize the value of your dental practice when you go to sell it.